humanitarian side. Former CNN senior international correspondent, founder of INARA, International Network for Aid, Relief, and Assistance, INARA. If you want to help, more than just on social media, go to INARA and you can donate. Arwood Amon joins us. And John Spencer, Chair, Urban Warfare Studies, the Modern War Institute at West Point. Good to have you back, sir.
Thanks, Chris.
So, John, just give us the nuts and bolts. When is it okay to go into a hospital and conduct a military operation, even if it is against alleged terrorists?
When you want to cause the least amount of damage to the hospital as possible, and you have intelligence driving that it is Hamas military commanders, it's like, what's the alternative? You want a missile being launched into the hospital floor?
No, I would say that you have to get them somewhere that isn't a non-combatant zone. I mean, isn't that part of the rules of engagement that you guys had to figure out when you were conducting your activities? When is something a hospital, a no-go zone, versus a place where you can do even a discrete operation?
Yeah, Chris, you're applying the law of armed conflict in either an internationally armed conflict or a non-international conflict to a different area. Israel is not in a war in the areas of the West Bank. That is more applicable to us invading Pakistan's airspace to get Osama bin Laden. That's the better analogy to use.
So this, you think, passes legal muster? How about the way they did it, not being in uniform, being undercover, shooting them in the hospital bed?
100%, I think it passes legal muster. It's not what you're talking about with the levels of protection of hospitals in wars, which, unless the combatant uses it for military purposes, it keeps its protection, and it's a very sensitive site. What you're talking about, what you watch that intelligence organization on film do to enter that hospital and to obtain Hamas terrorists, it's a separate situation, Chris.
Listen, John, I'm bringing you on because you're the expert. But obviously, hearing the explanations, while accurate, Arwa, is going to be very unsatisfying, and it's going to fuel a narrative that Israel is allowed to do what it says that the bad guys do.
Well, and it also begs the question of, these members who, Hamas and Islamic Jihad did say were members of their own organizations, were unarmed, and at least one of them was injured in the hospital, had been there for quite some time. And so it's going to beg the question as to why did Israel, feel the need to shoot them, to assassinate them, versus detain them and allow a judicial process to play out. After all, countries like to promote the fact that they adhere to, generally speaking, the rules of law, and that would also include a judicial process that someone, terrorist or not, does have a right to.
That's the high moral ground, right, John, is that, we don't talk about having the same standards for Israel as we do a terror organization. So what do you think will be the material analysis here in terms of who's armed, who isn't armed, how they're killed versus being brought into custody? Is there any guideline?
I'm sure. I mean, that's within Israel law, and to include in different types of organizations, wanted dead or alive is a concept. And again, don't apply a law of armed conflict construct to what you're observing in that targeted operation against a identified Hamas terrorist leader. It's completely separate. I mean, Osama bin Laden poked his head up around the corner and we terminated.
I get it. I just, I need you to help explain the differences in context to people, whether they accept it or not, because this is sticky stuff and people are going to be upset. Now, a clearer case on the humanitarian side, and John, I'll get your take on this as well, but I know that this isn't your bailiwick as directly Arwa. So the situation isn't just getting worse. It is allegedly getting worse because the grip on aid is not being relaxed, and that there is aid available, there's aid that people want to get in, and that Israel is employing a system that is either choking it off on purpose or by net effect of it being such an inefficient system. What's your take?
I mean, look, it's a bit of both, many would actually argue, because the whole concept of deconfliction that you and I have spoken about before is quite simply not working. So the aid that is getting into Gaza is not able to properly move to all of the populations that are in need. And this is resulting in a situation that no one has really ever seen before. Look, we've heard, senior humanitarian workers over and over again say that they've never seen famine spread through a population so quickly. We have the UN humanitarian relief chief who has said that hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza are not at risk of famine. They are actually in famine. This means that they are experiencing debilitating, painful levels of hunger. Children are fighting with each other over a scrap of bread. I saw a video of a man who, because he had gotten one bag of flour, was literally crying. Disease is spreading, things like what you mentioned there, Chris. And all of this obviously, contributes to malnutrition. And we talk about malnutrition without really understanding what that means. That causes, severe long-term health problems in children. You don't have access to clean water. You don't have a population right now that is able to survive. And when it comes to Israel doing what it can to facilitate access to aid, you really don't have someone who could be called anything close to a partner in assisting and doing what it can to allow aid to reach the population. Look, and you and I also, we were talking about this list of rejected items last week. Well, we can add also to that list right now metal poles, like the poles that you would use to put up your standard humanitarian tent. Those are not being permitted to cross, but the tarps are being permitted to cross. Children's toys were just rejected as well. So what Israel could do to facilitate aid, it is not doing.
Arwa, appreciate the perspective. John, let me just get you quick on this. This was an obvious focus. Arwa understands this better than I in terms of what the ISAF forces were doing in the Middle East when it was the war on terror. Giving people humanitarian aid was huge, even when it was dangerous. Even when our men and women were getting hurt by it. I've had the conversations with them where they were like, you cannot create the next generation of your enemy by starving the wrong people and by hurting the wrong people. You got to have the humanitarian aid. What's happening here in your estimation?
The context is vastly different, Chris. I mean, you have a combatant that is basically creating the entire area to be a war zone, and Israel doing everything and is doing a lot to get as much aid into Gaza, an active war zone where Hamas launched rockets from many areas near the aid zones just yesterday at Tel Aviv. When you have such a massive war, comparing it to anything you've seen in the global war on terrorism, I don't think it's the proper analogy. And we've seen Hamas take these aid trucks. We've seen Hamas launch rockets from the aid trucks. We've seen Israel actually open up their side and put soldiers in harm's way to assist in it. They searched trucks. They opened up the Erez. I was there last month. The Erez crossing point. They're flowing trucks through as fast as possible. But the proximity of this war, not just to the aid areas, are unique, but the whole entire context of the war. You can't apply a single battle construct, or like you said in a global war on terrorism, where humanitarian areas were set up way away from the battle. I mean, they're not inside the combat area.
I get it. It's just we know they got to do better, and we know they can do better, and we know it's the key to creating a future. And that's why I keep bringing it up. Is it different? Yes. But is it the same in terms of the human cost? And that's what's got to matter most. But John Spencer, I appreciate your perspective on it. Even if they're not comfortable answers, it's important to hear what the analysis is. And Arwa, thank you very much for keeping us trained on what matters most, which is making sure that the suffering doesn't have to extend to people who deserve it least. Thank you very much to both of you. I want to get a